I've been studying CSR now for 15, 20 years now, actually, since I was a PhD student. And my main finding is this. CSR is like teenage sex. Everybody says they're doing it, but in reality, very few are. And those that do it are doing it rather badly. So to, I guess, ask the question that, can CSR provide an effective guidance tool for corporations to do good? My instinctive answer is to say no. But being an academic, my answer will be it depends. So if we look at, I guess, the basic fundamentals. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my conclusions, my answers. Because I think answers are easy. Any fool can give you answers. I think the questions are difficult. So I want to work my way backwards from my conclusions and end my talk with the basic fundamental questions I think we should be looking at. So here goes. The corporation in its current form, the emphasis is mine, is an inappropriate agent for social change. CSR has become an ideological movement intended to legitimize and consolidate the power of large corporations. I'm saying in its current form because perhaps there are some transformative potential. I, for one, am not holding my breath. And in my research in the extractives industries, mining, oil, and gas, in the developing countries with tribal populations, I'm detecting a more dangerous form of CSR. Greenwashing is fine, that's innocent. Even a 2-year-old kid knows that what you see on TV commercial, take it with a pinch of salt. But I'm seeing CSR as being used as a weapon to neutralize resistance. CSR as a weapon to circumvent legislation. It's not just a greenwashing exercise. And I think that's a very dangerous trend, which has not been studied very well in my field. Surprise, surprise, I'm in a business school. The basic assumption is this, that the current neoliberal economy we live in is an economic capture of the social. So in neoliberal political economy, the social problem is not the anti-social effects of the economy, but rather the anti-competitive effects of any kind of social cooperation. And that's the fundamental reversal from, I guess, from the Keynesian approach to what we are living and suffering through now. And the same rationality, this is another sexy concept. Everybody talks about stakeholders, and I'm very critical of stakeholder theory. I argue that this instrumental and pragmatic approach to stakeholders cannot address social ills in any meaningful way. And that CSR is more beneficial for corporations than for society. If a corporation can do good only to help itself do well, this is the famous win-win situation, there is a profound limit on just how much good it can do. The CSR is not a new field in my field. 1950s, the research started on CSR, it's a long time ago. 60 years of research on CSR has told us very little. The main focus has been the link between CSR and financial performance. And despite 60 years of research, we still know very little about that link. And for me, that's not an empirical failure. For me, that represents a profound failure of the imagination, because the only question we as business school researchers are asking is there a link between CSR and financial performance? That is the wrong question to ask. The question should be, under what conditions in the political economy and corporate structures do we allow corporations to extract wealth and resources at the expense of social and environmental welfare? If you ask that question, we have a whole different kind of research agenda which emerges. And that's basically what I try to do in my work, is I'm looking at the problem with CSR, there's too much C, there's not enough S, not enough R. What you need to do is, I guess, forget about the corporation and look at the larger networks it operates in, the larger political economy, because that's where decisions are made which guides our lives. So that's basically the conclusions of my analysis of CSR. So let's just work backwards from that a little bit. As I said, if you look at the literature on CSR, you can notice two trends. One is a very American trend, and one is a fairly European trend. I'm using them simplistically. Two discourses. One is the efficiency hypothesis. Why does a corporation exist? Because it's a much more efficient way of producing goods and resources than just the markets. And one is a legitimacy discourse. So the assumption is that corporations are incorrigibly guided by self-interest. Okay, so exemplified by this quote, perhaps from the first ever management guru of the world, Peter Drucker, who said that CSR is a dangerous distortion. This is the almost tiresome cliche of Milton Friedman's, the business of business is business. And any activity directed at non-business stakeholders is a theft from shareholders. This has been pretty much discredited, but for some reason it still has currency amongst the Chicago schoolboys economics, because if you look at all the Fortune 500 companies, every single one has very strong CSR policies and investments in place. So in the real world, it doesn't really work. Then there is another assumption that corporations have an enduring capacity to operate on the basis of civic virtue. Again, exemplified by the quote. This is from William Ford Jr., current CEO and president of the Ford Motor Company, great-grandson of Henry Ford, that corporations should be and could be a major force for resolving environmental and social concerns in the 21st century. You guys have heard of the Global Compact, right? The United Nations Global Compact is the biggest multi-stakeholder initiative, 8,000 companies, I think. So when Kofi Annan launched the Global Compact, he made the statement that there's a happy convergence between what your shareholders pay you for, he was addressing the Fortune 500 CEOs, and what is best for millions of people the world over. Now, I don't know which millions Kofi Annan has been talking to. I can name maybe 100, 200 million people where the opposite is true, where what is best for shareholders comes at the expense of certain groups of people, which are win-lose situations, which is what I study in my work. Win-win is easy. The win-lose is more difficult to articulate and more difficult, perhaps, to come up with certain solutions. So the question for me then becomes, if there are conditions in the political economy that is allowing this accumulation by dispossession to happen, the more important question is, how do we then govern corporations to prevent this from happening? That becomes the fundamental question about CSR. To give you one example of this economic capture, the way system, and this reinforces some of the very key points Lindy made in her presentations, is how sustainability has been captured. I wrote a paper back in 2003, which is a critique of sustainability, sustainable development. And at that point of time, I counted 146 definitions of sustainability. There's probably a couple of hundred more. Now that tells me two things. One, nobody has a clue what it means. Or two, which is a more likely reason, it means different things to different people. If that is the case, then why and how does one particular definition become dominant? So all definitions, all languages are outcomes of certain power relations. So if you look at how sustainability first emerged, this is back to the classic Brundtle's definition that meets, everybody knows this, meets the needs and aspirations of the present without compromising the ability of future generations. Now, that's not a definition, that's a slogan. It's a pretty slogan, but there are some theoretical problems with that. What's a needs, what are wants are not articulated. Future generations who are not yet born face certain ontological difficulties in making their preferences heard today. So how does that also come into the picture becomes a bit of an issue. Anyway, to be fair to Brundtland, this was a roadmap for her. This wasn't a definition. She wanted to shift the discourse, and it did work. The discourse has shifted. Business pretty much ignored till the 90s this notion, and then they started getting a bit worried, and then they decided they need to do something. This is a definition by the Business Council for Sustainable Development, the world's most powerful NGO, consisting of the CEOs of 500 corporations. It's interesting. They're classified as an NGO. I attended the United Nations Climate Change Summit in Durban as an ethnographer. I wasn't allowed in because I was from a university NGO. These guys were allowed in the closed-door talks between the politicians. So there are NGOs and there are NGOs. So this is the definition: to maintain entrepreneurial freedom through voluntary initiatives. I have no idea how this suddenly came into sustainability. But you see where I'm going with this in terms of how particular concepts have been captured. Robert Shapiro was the ex-CEO of Monsanto, personally responsible for transforming Monsanto from a chemicals corporation to a life sciences corporation. Again, that might be a discursive transformation, but it has very real material effects. So far from being a soft issue grounded in emotional ethics, sustainability involves cold, rational business logic. And perhaps the final triumph of the corporate capture of sustainability comes from the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, which defines a sustainable corporation is one that aims at increasing long-term shareholder value by integrating economic, environmental, and social growth opportunities into its corporate and business strategies. This, of course, is your infamous triple bottom line. Now, it's interesting to see how definitions have emerged. You had development, sustainable development, then development became a dirty word. It moved to sustainability, which is more neutral, and now suddenly a sustainable corporation. So I guess I ask myself, why does a corporation have to be sustainable for the planet to be sustainable? Perhaps a corporation in its current form needs to be destroyed for the planet to be sustainable. And what happens when economic, environmental, and social issues are not growth opportunities? What does a company then do? Right? So I guess it's important for us to realize that these market-informed notions of sustainability, which are discursively created, have certain material practices in real-life policies on resource access, on resource use, on climate change policies, on pricing carbon. They have actually real effects. And I guess that's what I try and look at. And also, they have fairly disempowering consequences for millions of people, not the millions Kofi Annan speaks to, millions of people who are, I guess, at the receiving end of CSR practices. And I'm talking especially in one of my areas of research in the extractives industry, which a lot of the development anthropologists call livelihood struggles. I'm currently in I guess, the early stages of developing a research project which looks at violent anti-mining resistance movements across the world. As of today, there's 1,046 reported movements. I picked a sample of 25 countries, and my only condition they had to be violent, which means there's state violence in killing or dispossessing the communities. There's market violence. All the big mining companies have their own private armies. They're called private security forces, Shell, BP, Rio Tinto, which are often better equipped, better paid, better trained than the national government's army they work in. And this is a representative sample. There are more countries, but this is what I could fit into one slide. Out of this, I've chosen 25. Why 25? Because it fits on one A4 sheet of paper. Journal editors don't like tables which go more than one page. Now, what's common amongst these countries? Any pattern that you can see? All of them, except perhaps Thailand, are former colonies. That's not a coincidence. It is also not a coincidence that all the corporations involved in these conflicts are headquartered in London, Paris, Berlin, New York, Montreal. Okay? For me, there are two things which are more interesting. All these countries except China, Myanmar, and I think Laos is a constitutional monarchy, all these countries are quote-unquote democracies. So how do you explain in democratic countries the state is actively engaged in killing its own citizens? And for me, from a corporate perspective, what is also important is every single corporation, except the Chinese corporations involved in these conflicts, there's something quite refreshingly honest about the Chinese companies. They honestly don't give a damn about CSR. But they're learning, and once they realize CSR can be used as a weapon to literally get away with murder, you'll find more CSR language in the Chinese corporations. So all the Western corporations involved are signatories to the Global Compact, have CSR reports coming up out of the kazoo in every way, won environmental awards, social awards, are signatories to the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, which is another big multi-stakeholder initiative. So I guess my question is, if all these companies are doing these wonderful things, why are they violent conflicts? And the answer is twofold. One is either they're implementing it wrong, the intention is good, the policy is strong, is a failure of implementation. Or as I argue, no, I think there are structural problems with the concept itself. It's not an implementational issue. Just to give you, I guess, a representative view, pictorially where this is coming from. So we all know where the resources are being extracted from. We also know where they're actually going. Okay? Which brings us to, I guess, the real issue, what I think is fundamentally wrong with CSR. The problem with CSR, if you take its argument to its logical extreme, you end up in a situation where a corporation is responsible for everything but accountable for nothing. Okay? So I think we need to start shifting the discourse to look at the governance of CSR. And I mean governance of CSR, not corporate governance, not about a director's responsibility to shareholders, but the governance of corporations for society. And that needs a much more broader unit of analysis. So I started engaging in the governance literature, which is a mind-numbingly boring literature. And there are many, many definitions. Once institutions like the World Bank and IMF take a concept, it's very wise to abandon it completely. So now World Bank reports are now full of governance and capacity building. Anyway, this is one of the definitions. I think this is the United Nations definition. The range of formal and informal, blah, blah, blah. It's very boring. I went to sleep halfway, completely sanitized. Doesn't tell you anything. So I was dissatisfied with this, and I came up with my own definition of CSR governance, which is it has less to do with how corporations can penetrate civil society or enter into dialogue with civil society actors, but more to do with how marginalized and impoverished communities, who are often non-corporate, non-state, and non-market actors, can ensure their rights are protected in a democracy. Now, if you define governance in this way, a whole different series of questions emerge. If you want to operationalize governance in this way, a very different set of questions emerge, right? And that's the kind of fundamental logic which I'm trying to deal with. Yeah, dialogue is great, but let's not forget dialogue is a weapon of the powerful. And much of the stakeholder engagement dialogue occurs in very structurally unequal terms. Let me end by this. I know I've been a bit cynical. I want to move to the positive side. David Corten, who's the American economist and activist, came up with a definition of a responsible corporation. One that produces and sells only safe. I'm not going to read this out by yourself. Now, I don't know what David has been smoking, but it's really good. I really wish he would pass it around, because I can't imagine any of this happening on a voluntary basis. Now, I know David, I respect him, he's a good guy. In his defense, whenever he's been attacked for being naive, he said, all right, this is my definition, you come up with a better one. And nobody does. So if we really have to take this and operationalize this in the way I framed it in the governance mechanism, then we've got to start asking different questions. So I'll just end with what I think some ways we can look at. Again, I'm not going to get into details about this. Looking at extended, some of this is already happening across the world, mainly through direct action. This has not happened by voting people in, voting people out. This has happened through direct action, unfortunately or fortunately. Property rights, a key issue. How do you enforce communal property rights in a system which is completely obsessed with individual property rights? Don't forget, the legal definition of a corporation is an artificial person, okay, which enjoys protection by the American Bill of Rights, but doesn't have the corresponding responsibilities enshrined legally. So there's a bit of legal fiction here. So let me end by the questions, as I promised. What kind of questions arise from my analysis? What are the limits of CSR? How do we know when these limits are reached? What are the structures and processes in the political economy that enable consolidation of power while weakening the power of state and civil society actors? These are questions you probably won't see in a management textbook. How do we understand and explain anti-corporate activity, resistance movements, protest movements, like the Occupy movement, the World Social Forum? And how can corporations and the economy be governed to prevent environmental and social damage? I will end with a quote by a very famous left-wing economist. I'm not going to read this out, except perhaps key parts that it comes from an order of men, whose interest is never exactly the same with that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, and accordingly have upon many occasions both deceived and oppressed. This, of course, is from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Thank you for your time and attention, folks. I'm happy to take any questions.